Hello, everyone, and welcome to this first installment of Japanese literature and culture before what year? 1600. So that's this particular class. I will be your guide through this epic journey in pre-modern Japanese literature. My name is Nicholas Tyson. I've been teaching for a while now, not just at Syracuse, but in a bunch of other places as well. I don't really have a lot to say other than, welcome. I guess I should talk a little bit about the structure. So we're going to be posting generally 2, sometimes 3 videos a week, each on a particular topic. This first video is going to be talking about what exactly Japan is and who the Japanese are, what Japan is, Japanese, etc. And the other video for this week will be going into the sort of prehistorical, quote unquote, Japanese periods, specifically the Jomon, the Yaoi, and the Kofun periods. So, we might as well just go ahead and get started. I have a cough drop in my mouth, so I apologize for that if you hear a clacking sound. Here we see Japan. Each week, I'm also going to have an outline that I'll go through just so everybody can keep track and follow along, and eventually I will post this to the course site so that way you'll have it for review. Okay, so it might seem strange, but we first have to ask, what exactly is Japan? And that may seem like an odd question, but historically, Japan is this thing that sort of evolved over time. And in this outline, I've kind of come up with a bunch of different ways to think about it. So first and foremost, we can think of Japan as a physical territory. And even here, things already start to get complicated. So the original conception of Japan was as the 8 islands, the so-called Yashima. And that includes the modern-day islands of Honshu, Kyushu, Shikoku, Awaji, Iki, Tsushima, which was recently made famous in a video game, which maybe some of you have played, Okusho, and Sado. Now, what's interesting about the Yashima, these original 8 islands, is that it's not a lot of what is modern-day Japan. And in fact, the conception of the Yashima is essentially just this area here. So Tsushima's here, Iki's here, Kyushu's here, Shikoku. And then when they say Honshu, they're not actually thinking of all of Honshu, all of the banana, as I usually call it. They're pretty much only thinking of Honshu like here, up to basically this point right here. The reason for that will be explained in a little bit. The reason why this is because it was centered around the historical Yamato Clan. And so the Yamato province is here. And so that was considered to be pretty much more or less the most eastward point of expansion. You see Ise over here, I guess it's technically part of it as well. But all of this up here wasn't really considered to be part of the 8 islands, the so-called Yashima. But that's not the only territorial conception of Japan. You also, in Chinese sources, have the so-called Kingdom of Wo, as it's usually pronounced in Chinese. Apologies for my Chinese pronunciation. In Japanese, it's usually called Wa, and that Wa component is used quite consistently even in modern Japanese. Now, what's interesting about this is that in the Chinese sources, particularly the the Book of Wei, from the Record of the Three Kingdoms, they use that character, which I know there are quite a few Chinese speakers in the class, so you'll probably know that that is an extremely pejorative term. It basically refers to the early Japanese people as dwarves. So it's the kingdom of the dwarves. Japanese sources very quickly start to use this character over here instead, which for you Chinese speakers also probably recognize this. So it's the land of peace and harmony. Instead of being the land of dwarves, it's the land of harmony. And as I know here, this is primarily according to Chinese sources, because we don't really have Japanese sources, until well into the 6th and 7th centuries. Now, the Chinese sources identify this shaman queen named Himiko, and I have a picture of her. This is a statue, and so actually it says it right up here. That's helpful for me. At Kanzaki Station And this is, you know, obviously a reconstruction of what she supposedly looked like. No one really knows what she looked like. In fact, no one even knows if she was in fact real. There are no Japanese sources that attest to the existence of this person. And as I will talk about in my subsequent video for this week, it's not even clear whether or not the word Himiko is a name. In fact, it may not be a name at all. And I noted this, that this term wa here is extremely charged term in Chinese. It's basically a way of, you know, we're talking about a period in world history where the Chinese definitely thought of themselves as the center of the world, and in many ways rightly so. They were definitely probably the most advanced civilization at the time. And so the Japanese didn't figure very prominently in that cosmology, and so it was perfectly acceptable to think of them this way. Another interesting way to think about them territorially is as I have here, a vassal state. So now technically throughout the entire pre-modern period, so basically the entire period that this course covers, Japan was technically a vassal, or a tributary, more specifically, state to the various Chinese dynasties that existed throughout Japanese history. So what does this mean? It meant that technically, another term for this relationship is a suzerain relationship, suzerainty. What this meant is that the individual like states that were within the Chinese sphere of influence, you know, Korea, you know, Indochina, Japan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they were all relatively independent in terms of their like domestic affairs. I say relatively independent because, you know, the Chinese conquered various states in its sphere of influence at various periods of time. But as far as like foreign policy was concerned, the various Chinese states were considered to be dominant. So the idea was that China controls like interrelationships between states, but the states themselves have relative autonomy. Now, this is both important and not important for Japan. It's important because oftentimes Japanese history is not really well discussed in terms of sort of the larger geopolitical context, and I'm going to try and do that this time. However, what's interesting about Japan's tributary relationship to the Chinese is that Japan was a very bad vassal, basically ignored the Chinese, what they wanted, and oftentimes were in direct conflict with them, particularly when the Mongol Empire took over operations of Greater China, and the Mongols tried to invade Japan, and Japanese very famously fought them off. Again, there's a big question mark around that. But the other interesting thing is that, so another thing that we need to note is that in terms of sort of like the territorial integrity of Japan, there is another country that is now part of Japan that perhaps many people don't even think of as distinct from Japan. So that's the Ryukyus, these islands here, most notably Okinawa down here. In this time period, basically until the Edo period, really, the Ryukyus were an entirely separate kingdom. So, and that kingdom actually had a really good relationship with China. In fact, they had a very special like trading status with China. The Japanese were pretty much the exact opposite. Also, you have Japan's relationships with the three major Korean kingdoms, which my Korean is terrible. So Goguryeo, Silla, Baekje. Baekje, I think it's Baekje. Anyway, again, my Korean is terrible. Apologies. So Japan is kind of an outlier in the Chinese sphere of influence because it was technically part of it, didn't really want to be part of it, and often did everything in its power to try and like extricate itself. So aside from thinking of Japan in territorial terms, you can also think of it as a kind of a concept, as an idea. So Japan is technically an empire? What I mean by that is that, okay, so this is again an issue of perspective. From the perspective of Chinese sources, Japanese rulers were usually referred to as kings, right there. However, in Japanese sources, they were ruled by emperors. I'm not 100% clear as to the reason for this. The explanation that I usually hear is that Japan conceptually, particularly in its early incarnation, because it was sort of an assemblage or a confederation of clans, the idea is that sort of each clan was its own. In fact, even in the Chinese sources often refer to as the Kingdom of Wo as having many nations or many states. And so then the one person who rules over this would be an emperor. At least that's the way they saw it from the Japanese perspective. But again, from the Chinese perspective, it's very different. Also worth noting is that, particularly in this early period, you have many distinct ethnic groups. Perhaps the most important are, the people of the land of the Izumo. This comes up in the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki. The Emishi, I have an illustration. This is, so the Emishi were the characters that are used to write Emishi basically emphasize their barbarity. One of the characters literally is the character for like savage or barbarian. And so you can see in this image the kind of conceptual distinction between the sort of like the cultured, well-dressed, clean-shaven Japanese guys, and then you have these emishi who have big, scraggly beards. They got rags on their heads. They're wearing, like barely held together, furs and straw garments. Another famous emishi. I thought this would be fun. So we have Ashitaka from the film Mononoke Hime, Princess Mononoke. He was supposedly Emishi. He's identified as Emishi in the film, even though at that point the Emishi were extinct. And so the Japan, again, Japan in scare quotes, was this thing that sort of steadily crept eastward as it both assimilated and in some cases annihilated other ethnic groups. So that's fun. Another important way to think of Japan in this period, in the period that this course will cover, is a kind of like bifurcated state. Now, this is more true later on and will be sort of relevant in the next period. No, actually, in the last two periods that we talk about with the first and the second shogunates. So Japan, for most of its pre-modern history, had two centers of power. It had the court at Kyoto, or as it's sometimes called Heian-kyo, the Heian capital. And then usually a military power. So, for example, the Kamakura shogunate. Kamakura is much, much further east in Japan. So you generally have sort of like a Western and an Eastern power base. One of the reasons why I have a cough drop in my mouth is because my throat is a little raggy. I'm not sick or anything. I'm not dying. I don't have COVID. Please don't turn me in. No, I'm fine. And this causes a lot of problems throughout Japanese pre-modern history because it's often unclear to like foreign states who to deal with. I'm just going to leave it at that. Also conceptually, it's possible to think of Japan as sort of a loose shifting confederation. Now, this is especially true in the Kofun period, which I'll talk about in my next video, and then also much, much later in what is usually referred to as the Sengoku period, or really not even just the Sengoku period, but from the period of like the early 15th century until the 17th century, where you have, warlords who are kind of constantly at each other's throats. And as I've noted here, what's interesting about Japan is that sort of these warlords often have a great deal of regional power and regional autonomy. And a lot of the history of Japan, particularly post-Heian period, is about how to keep these local warlords in line and even just how to understand their like constantly shifting confederations. And what's interesting about this from sort of like this is interesting Japanese studies perspective is that there's often this preconception of Japanese warrior culture, particularly of the post-Heian era, as being, very like, oh, my honor, oh, I cannot do this because of my honor, oh, crap like that. The thing is, these people were not these people were assholes. They were constantly betraying each other. They were constantly doing all sorts of ridiculous shit. They were constantly acting in their own like best political interest, the way pretty much everyone in the even in the modern world does. So they're not really any different. This idea that sort of warrior culture in Japan was ruled by this like incredibly complex set of like codes and values is mostly crap. And I want to emphasize that throughout this course. So TLDR for all this, Japan as a concept, as a thing, is something that is constantly in flux. So it's going to be important as we're going through this course to sort of think about like which Japan we're talking about at which particular point in time. Okay, on to my next major point for this video. So if Japan is an open question, well then so are the Japanese. So who exactly are the Japanese? And again, I broke this down into sort of various ways of thinking about it. So you can think about the Japanese. Oh, I had this really great picture of Ainu. Okay, this is what the Ainu look like. So we have the Emishi. Again, the other ethnic groups in Japan, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in relationship to the Jomon. Like they tended to look, well, frankly, not very Japanese, or at least not very like sort of modern Japanese. So who are these Japanese? Well, you can think of them as a racial group, kind of. But again, this is complicated by the fact that sort of who the Japanese, genetically speaking, are now is mostly derived from this group of people from the Yayoi period, right here. So it's these dudes, and this is sort of typical of Yayoi period. This sort of like tying your hair up in this like loose. It's not even really a bun. It's like a cord that you sort of tie to the side of your head. This is very typical of very early sort of Japanese hairstyles. She's just got her regular ponytail, so she's rocking out. That's cute. You got a Shiba Inu down here. It's cute. Yeah, so very typical of the sort of prehistorical Yayoi period Japanese. Now, this is sort of the group that is most closely associated with, at least in genetic terms, the later Japanese. The reason why this is important is that they were not the first native inhabitants of the Japanese archipelago. That's usually associated with a group of people called the Jomon, who, well, the Yayoi kind of eradicated. But we'll get into that in the next video. And as I know here, they are the second major cultural grouping to inhabit Japan. So as I said earlier, defining the Japanese in racial terms is really tricky because it's kind of a floating signifier if you guys are linguistics fans. In other words, what the Japanese are in racial terms kind of changes depending on who's asking the question. And this is made doubly complicated by the fact that in modern Japanese sociological discourse, there is this entire like field of study called it's called Nihonjinron or Nihon Bunkaron, which is like a theory of Japaneseness or theories of Japanese culture, which is extremely right-wing, and basically tries to identify this like trans-historical Japanese identity, which if you bother to read any academic literature at all, you'll realize is total crap, but it's very popular and it informs a lot of misconceptions. So we can also think of the Japanese as an ethnic group. As I noted earlier, they're most closely associated with the Yamato clan. In fact, that word Yamato in many ways comes to stand in later periods for the Japanese people themselves, even though originally it was just a clan. It was one clan of many. But the reason why it comes to stand in for the Japanese polity itself is because it's most closely associated with the Japanese imperial family. So the Yamato clan are the ones who, so the emperors and empresses and princes and princesses and all that, they're the ones most directly descended from this particular clan, or the sun goddess, depending on who you ask. And also this particular, the sort of members of this clan are the ones who figure most prominently both in Japanese legends and in Japanese historiographic texts. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a problem. Next week, we'll be reading the Kojiki. And the line between history writing and myth writing just isn't there in these early Japanese historiographic texts. And so that's something to bear in mind. Sometimes you're often reading an amalgam of legend and like verifiable historical fact. Now, this ethnic group, as I noted earlier, was just one of many. And these sort of legendary historical / legendary stories often tell the tale of how the Yamato either eradicated or assimilated these other ethnic groups. Now, some of these groups were completely assimilated. And again, I feel like I have to use assimilated in scare quotes because really they're sort of assimilated and eradicated because there were, wars of conquest that were fought as the Japanese expanded eastward. So here you see the emishi in this sort of position of servility, and you see, a Japanese court noble on his horse, sort of, taking obeisance from them. And this is his servant. Even his servant is like, yeah, bow to me, weaklings. But the reason why a film like Mononoke is so interesting is because it tackles this idea of like the eradication of other like indigenous ethnic identities in Japan. Like that's actually a subtext of the film. Well, one that you would have to sort of know is there because it's not really harped on. But then you have other groups like the Ainu. This is a photograph from 1904, so clearly they weren't eradicated in early Japanese history. But Japan has sort of a complex history of how it relates to its indigenous ethnic groups. In fact, the Ainu weren't even recognized as like officially they were in fact recognized as a distinct ethnic group for quite a long time, but officially weren't recognized as a distinct ethnic group in the past, I think it was 20 years. So very, very recently. And this has a lot to do with, modern Japanese hang-ups about racial identity, ethnicity, and foreignness and all that. And I don't want to get into that because we're not really talking about modern Japan. But the Ainu are still around. That's the point. The Emishi, gone. Ainu, still around. And as I noted earlier, you also have the Okinawans or the Kingdom of the Ryukyus, as it's usually known. They were not actually drawn into the greater Japanese political sphere of influence until well into the 19th century. Like there were parts of the Ryukyu Islands that were part of the Kyushu or Satsuma domain. Or was it? I think it's the Satsuma. No, it wasn't. It's the other one. It's the other domain in Kyushu. Its name is escaping me. Anyway, it was considered part of Kyushu. In fact, today it's considered part of the Mami Islands are considered part of Kyushu Prefecture. But the Kingdom of the Ryukyus wasn't formally integrated into the Japanese state until the late 19th century. So Okinawans at this point in time, a distinct thing. So the last conceptual way in which the Japanese race is understood is as direct descendants of the sun goddess, and her name is here, Amaterasu Omikami. And we'll talk more about her when we read the Kojiki. This is important because the Japanese imperial line considers itself to be directly descended from the gods, and not just any old god, but a big god, the sun lady. The sun lady is the progenitor of the Japanese race. And this is interesting because, again, as we'll see when we read the Kojiki, the Japanese have their own distinct cosmology that only really explains the existence of Japan. Doesn't really explain anything else, and it's one of its oddities. But all of this together sort of creates this conception of sort of like a distinct, unique, often perversely unique sort of species of human or race of human beings who are, isolated on their 8 islands. And that causes a lot of problems basically throughout Japanese history, even until today. So, the takeaway from all this is that, as I note here in my TLDR, the Japanese are a group mostly limited to what we now know as the Japanese archipelago, who slowly absorbed or didn't absorb other ethnic groups. And this is actually going to be an important thing, this idea of sort of like absorption and sort of like assimilation. This is something that we'll see come up again and again. So, but for now, that's what is Japan and who are the Japanese. Stick around for this week's other video. I suppose I could stop my screen share. So that's all for this video. Stay tuned for the, what is it? What's the other video? Oh, you'll just see it in the other video. So until then, bye.